in the 1870s, there were about a dozen architects in the state. And so it gives you a sense of between Portland and Lewiston and Bangor, some of the larger cities. There were not that many, and there was a lot of building going on. It's in this setting that George Coombs establishes himself as an architect at the age of 19, thus born the firm that presently exists. And so at 19 years old, this is 1870. Pretty young, striking it out, entrepreneurial spirit. Coombs shortly thereafter begins working for Charles Douglas in 1872. And so that's where some of that discrepancy I was talking about kind of occurs, that fuzziness. It says in some sources that he apprenticed under Douglas. Douglas was an architect in the area. This is again another shot of the development of Lewiston at the time that this is occurring. Douglas is responsible. He's a leading architect in western Maine, not necessarily the southern Maine. There were sort of distinctions at that time as well. He had a large number of important projects on the boards, including Continental Mill Number 1, which is behind the beautiful Continental Mill that, or what's left of the sort of Second Empire style that we see today. He was also responsible for Lyceum Hall, which folks know as the home of Fuel restaurant, and also the Barker Mill in Auburn. So Douglas has somewhat of a storied career already, and it's into this that Coombs becomes an apprentice. Again, that's in 1872, 2 years after the establishment of Coombs. There are a couple drawings that survive in the Coombs archive from the Douglas era, if you will, from when Coombs worked with Douglas. And that was an Auburn firehouse of 1871 and a Lewiston firehouse of 1873. Douglas moves to Philadelphia and seeks to find his fortunes there. And so Coombs, at the age of 23, and now actually having worked for an architect, was considering opening his own practice again, but opted instead to form a partnership with Charles Kimball of Portland. And Kimball was another well-known architect in the era. Not the same as there's a Charles F. Kimball. This is not the same. He was a landscape painter. They're really a few projects that survive of Kimball's, and some of them, I think there's Eastport, there's a bank in Eastport, as well as a church in Freiburg. So not a lot survives from that, and Coombs only stays there for about a year. And then Kimball moves off, and then Coombs becomes associated with another noteworthy Lewiston citizen, William Stevens. And hence this is the Stevens of which Coombs and Stevens is, or Stevens and Coombs rather, is known. Stevens was educated in architecture and hydraulic engineering and began work under Albert Kelsey at the Franklin Company in the 1860s. It was during this time that he worked on a number of projects, including the Warumbo Mills in Lincoln. He was also pretty active, and I think this is the Warumbo Mill we have right here. Oh, actually, that's going back. Lyceum Hall, that we talked about already. So Stevens is also pretty active on the political scene in Lewiston. He was seventh mayor of Lewiston in the 1870s. Stevens was in practice for a year, and again, this is sort of a theme that develops with in partnership with Francis Fassett, another very well-known leading architect at the time in Maine. Fassett was born in Bath. He's credited with a number of projects, including that there's a beautiful Baxter Library on Congress Street in Portland, and that's actually in the process of being renovated right now. The Maine General Hospital in Portland, which later became Maine Medical Center, and Corthell Hall at the what is now the University of Southern Maine. So Fassett is a really large figure in Maine architecture at the time, and it's in 1873-74 that George Coombs is working for him. It's also interesting because John Calvin Stevens, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with that name, but he is again another very big figure. He would apprentice with Fassett in 1873 as well, although probably in Fassett's Portland office. And so at one time, it's possible that Coombs and Stevens, John Calvin Stevens, were in the same apprenticeship under the same person. What's neat about that is that John Calvin Stevens' firm continues to this day, known as SMRT, big competitor of Harriman. And so the thought that at some point in their history they could actually have shared a same boss is kind of fascinating. Stevens eventually went and started work in Boston for a while, and then came back and started his own practice after leaving Facet. It's very likely that Coombs began working for Stevens in '74, and the first credit to Coombs with the practice of Facet and Stevens is the William P. Fry House on the corner of Main and Fry, still there to this day at 457 Main Street in Lewiston. It's one of the finest residential examples of the Second Empire style, which was pretty popular at the time. Essentially, that it was characterized by we see the mansard roofs, and they're with elaborate bracketed cornices, and you can see how elaborate the brackets get on the corners right here in this projection right here. But these brackets continue all the way around, and even bracketed off of the canopy roofs at the doors. The three-story rectangular volumes with projecting bays. These projecting bays, you can see one right here. There are two on the Main Street facade. Are not necessarily Second Empire in nature. They're probably more likely from English origin. They're highly stylized and paneled, and rise to the roof cornice at these projections, and so they really enliven that facade as well. The Second Empire style was born out of the École des Beaux-Arts, which was France's leading architectural school at the time, and the French Baroque. It was perceived at the time that as the most culturally advanced style, and so these folks who had some level of wealth wanted to express that, and so the style caught on quickly in New England primarily. It was also perhaps the best known example in the United States at the time was the Philadelphia City Hall. And again, we have the mansard roofs. Here, this is nearly the same time, constructed at nearly the same time as the Fry House, but it actually, the planning for it began about 10 years prior to, and like a lot of projects even today, funding was an issue, and so the plans stood on the shelf until there was enough money to fund it. So Stevens then ends his relationship with Francis Facet in 1874 and offers a partnership with George Coombs. Coombs would accept the partnership, and that relationship would endure for 5 years until the death of Stevens at the age of 62. It's understood that Mr. Stevens, being highly experienced in hydraulic engineering, was probably more inclined to the utilitarian purpose of these projects and sought out complementing skills for the design of these things. And so the first talented designer he connected with was Facet, and the second one being Coombs. Among the more widely known projects of this period are many residences for a lot of the wealthy citizens in Lewiston, Auburn, but also as far away as Brunswick and Harpswell and Thomaston. One of the surviving works from this firm, or some of them, one of them is, so here's some of the major works of this period of time, this 5-year period. The Centennial Block in Lewiston on Lisbon Street, Chase House on Fry Street, the Lewiston Bleachery, which still exists today on Adams and Lisbon Street, the Oddfellows Block, which we'll look a little bit at in a minute here, which still exists on Lisbon Street, the Poland Spring House, or some portion thereof, the YMCA Block, which is on 4th Street in Auburn, and a house for Mr. George M. Coombs, the very one we're speaking of, at 6 Pleasant Street. And this was sort of fascinating because the day after I looked that up, I was driving down Pleasant Street in search of this, and it still exists right there. It's sort of discreetly held back from the street